Thank you. Thanks to Martin for your talk. I wish we could take the conference Wi-Fi connectivity for granted, I have to say. I'll start with this. This picture is in Manchester, maybe nearly 20 years ago, when I helped build a digital network for an area called the Northern Quarter, which may or may not have been one of the first in Europe. I don't know, because we didn't really count that kind of thing at the time. But it was working with local businesses and citizens, basically to show them the internet, to see if it would catch on, basically. And it did catch on, and the area is doing okay. But it was interesting at that point to look at this relationship between technology and cities. And I'll talk about that a bit now. So because I'm English, I'm comfortable talking about failure, and I have many of them as well. But I'm just going to talk about three. I was involved in a project called The Cloud for the London Olympics, which came second. The one that won was the structure next to the Olympic Stadium. This idea was working with Carlo Ratti at MIT and a whole bunch of other people. It was actually the mayor's favorite, but when the mayor is Boris Johnson, that's a bit of a poisoned chalice. You don't really want it to be his favorite, but anyway. It didn't work. The idea was that it would be a civic smart meter at the scale of London, basically. Google were a partner, so we could use Google's data about London and reflect that back at a kind of collective scale for miles around, potentially. It was a failure. Similar projects in Sydney, a university building which reveals the patterns of activity on the network going on inside the building, on the outside of the building. Most buildings, as you know, are quite opaque. If you walk past this place, you'd have no idea really that this conference was going on, but there's all kinds of interesting activity digitally occurring, which creates a kind of echo of the physical activity, which you could tap into and engage with what urbanists call placemaking. How do you reveal the character of a place? Given some of that's working on the network now, that didn't happen either. And this is my most spectacular failure, which was a metro project for Sydney, which was cancelled after a change of government. One government proposed the metro project, spent hundreds of millions of Australian dollars on it, and the next one didn't like the metro, so cancelled it. But we were working on these large-scale visualizations in metro environments of real-time transit activity in all kinds of ways, looking at the pattern of trains themselves, but also looking at mobile phone data to see which bits of the station are busy, which end of the train is busy, that kind of stuff. None of them worked, and there's many more like that didn't work. And it got me interested, in a way, as to why things don't happen. Now, it could just be they were terrible ideas, and indeed, sometimes they were. But almost to Martin's point again, we kind of know what the 21st century city should be like, in a way, in terms of making it more resilient environmentally, for instance. We have the technology to do almost anything. In terms of buildings and cities, architecturally, we've got extraordinary capacity now. Technically, as Martin described, the world of physical things and digital things is merging to create potentially almost anything we can imagine. So we can technically solve things like climate change or healthcare or aging population. Basically, we can do that. We can look at Germany and see what it's done with wind power to see all of the case studies we need. But why doesn't that happen? Why is it so difficult to do? I did a lot of work in Finland in the last couple of years. Why don't they look at Germany and do what Germany's done with wind power? It's right there. It's the answer is right in front of them, but that doesn't happen. And it's not for technical reasons. It's not for business plan reasons. I go back to this British architect, Cedric Price, from the mid-60s. So nearly 40, 50 years ago now, who said kind of smartly, technology is the answer, but what's the question? We don't spend enough time thinking about what the question is. How do we frame the question correctly? Again, we have the technology, and we usually jump on a solution too quickly without stepping back and saying, well, what are we doing? Why? This is where I'm interested in terms of smart cities, which some of you will know. Because it's the case that a good idea or a technology isn't enough in itself. That doesn't make things happen, and actually it's not necessarily the right thing to do. To make things happen, to do the right things, it's not a technology problem. And so we were interested in how can design help redress the context around the thing, the decision making. Why doesn't Finland do what Germany does with wind power, for instance? Why can't we build timber buildings 14 stories high? Technically, it's easy. It's not expensive either. The decision-making context is the issue there. That's the thing we need to spend our time thinking about now. The technology is the easy bit. when it comes to these large-scale decisions, we often look to institutions to make them or at least frame them. And this is why we're struggling with things like climate change or healthcare or aging population, these kind of so-called wicked problems. 1972, there was a paper by a couple of sociologists describing them as wicked problems. Things that are massively complex, interdependent, at scale, globalized and localized simultaneously, almost beyond comprehension as a system. Our institutions cannot address those things effectively. Governance, education, legal environment, and so on, they're not really fit for the 21st century, we'd say. In a way, they produced the problem, actually. So climate change is created by the same institutions that we're now looking to fix climate change, which is perhaps why it's not working. You can't use the same tool that created the problem to try and fix the problem a lot of the time. And you see this quite clearly. In the UK, the riots a couple of years ago were a very visceral example of an institutional collapse, a complete breakdown between society and government in a very particular situation, very difficult for people to understand actually afterwards in a way why it had happened coherently. Lots of reasons, but nothing clear. Occupy, this is Occupy Rome, which is perhaps more visceral than some of the Occupy movements you've seen elsewhere, but that's Rome. So the Occupy movement is also a clear example of this breakdown. In Tahrir Square, the Arab Spring movement, again, you see this pattern, and there's an interesting pattern here actually of what I call the piazza and social media working together as enablers, not drivers. People sometimes mistake the driver for the enabler, but the combination of Facebook and Tahrir Square is what's occurring here in a way. It's as an enabler. The driver is something else, poverty, disenfranchisement, corruption, all kinds of other things. With Occupy, it was Twitter plus Zuccotti Park. In the UK, we don't really have piazzas, we don't really do them, so it was the high street and BlackBerry Messenger in that case. In Athens, this is what you see. Again, you could go on. As you know, there are 10 examples easily of this institutional collapse. And all the data shows massive drop of faith in institutions' ability to deliver. So the culture of decision-making itself becomes a design challenge. My former colleague at Citra, the Finnish Innovation Fund, said, we have 18th century institutions facing 21st century problems. This is a design challenge worthy of addressing our sights on, perhaps. What's interesting at the moment, if we look in Italy, this is Beppe Grillo, the leader of the Movimento 5 Stelle, 5-star movement, who swept to some success in the recent national elections, didn't spend a cent on advertising, no billboards, no newspaper ads, refused to talk to any mainstream media, nothing at all, no TV, no newspaper interviews, but just went to piazza after piazza after piazza every single night and used the internet very effectively. Got the most votes in the election. In a major Western democracy, 60 million people, that approach got the most votes. And that would be unthinkable even 6 months ago, to take that approach, to refuse to talk to any mainstream media. What political party do you know does that? So this is interesting. This is a networked response to kind of an institutional failure, and based around these kind of two ideas. A quick institutional story from Helsinki. This is a skate sculpture commissioned by the city of Helsinki. So designed to be skateboarded on, basically. It says the word Helsinki. It's not very nice, but anyway, it's a public art thing. They installed it, and then they got a lot of complaints from the apartments either side of this thing about the noise in the night of people skateboarding on the sculpture, perhaps predictably. So what they did was that they sent out a bulldozer to cut a hole around the sculpture. So they were basically vandalizing their own project. The city council was vandalizing its own project. It was almost psychotic behavior in a way, if you saw a human doing this. One bit commissioned it, the other bit vandalizes it in the same thing. Then, of course, there were complaints about the complaints. So this is actually video of the same poor guys going to have to fill in the hole that they just dug the week before, putting the tarmac back in. Again, it's strange behavior. It's very odd, but I almost feel for the city, because what are they supposed to do? Like, how many complaints is enough? Is 50 complaints, or 200, or 2,000? There's no rule for this kind of thing. People can effectively complain quicker and easier than ever. You can organize a not in my backyard movement, a NIMBY movement, effortlessly now over the internet. And the city council struggles with this. Like, how do they respond? They don't actually have the weapons for that battle, so they end up looking silly. Meanwhile, across town, there's an amazing thing going on called Ravintolapaiva, which means Restaurant Day, which is a street food festival organized by people who are frustrated at how long it took to open up a restaurant. So they said, well, sod that. Let's not go through the rigmarole of opening up a restaurant. Let's just say we declare a day, Restaurant Day. Everybody can make a pop-up restaurant, do whatever you like. We'll organize it on Facebook. If enough people do it, what could go wrong? That's what happened. So this woman's making egg and bacon muffins in her back kitchen in the window and lowering out of her apartment to the street below. And when you put €3 in the basket, and then you get an egg and bacon muffin back, which is quite good because it's quite difficult to get egg and bacon muffins in Helsinki. This is an Argentinian woman making empanadas in her, and that's actually a human empanada in the foreground there to advertise it. So it's this beautiful thing. It's a wonderful day. This is a Thai soup kitchen in a park. To be clear, all of these are illegal. So they don't have the permits for any of this stuff. No one's got a permit to make food and sell it in public. It's very interesting because the city council couldn't touch it because there were so many people doing it. There are now maybe 300-400 pop-ups every time it happens, every 4 months. What can they possibly do? And it's so clearly good. It's so clearly a civic good. They would just be, like a pantomime villain if they tried to go around the city scooping these things into a Black Maria. So they can't touch it, nor can they promote it because it's still illegal, which is kind of interesting. So it's this amazing day. It feels full of joy. You see people on the streets you've never seen before. You see a diversity of food that you just can't get. What's interesting, this is a kiosk that was near me, which I walk past every day thinking, why doesn't that thing make me a bloody cup of coffee? It was always closed because there's a 2-year lease requirement for this. If you want to take out this space, you need to sign up for 2 years. What entrepreneur can possibly commit if you have half an idea? Maybe I can make espressos. Maybe I can make sushi. But you can't commit to a 2-year thing. You just don't know. So Ravintolapaiva is interesting almost from a startup point of view. It gives you a chance to try it out. But it isn't for us, it isn't for me about access to better coffee, although it would be nice if it was. But when you look at food, actually what you're dealing with is all of these things. All of these things are tied up in something basic like street food. And actually to me, what Restaurant Day is about is understanding what public space can be. Who decides what the street is for? It's not just the city council's job to do that, right? This is Schönberg in Berlin, not far from here, where citizens actually make the planter boxes outside of their apartment blocks. They look after them themselves. And it's beautiful, what a lovely planter box. The city couldn't do that, actually, because every apartment block is different, so every planter box is different. So you get this lovely pattern down the streets. Again, if the city did it, it would just be a consistent line of the same kind of plants, because that makes sense. So these things aren't strictly legal, but they are clearly very good. I mean, you can't walk down that street and think, this is, what's wrong with this? This is great. They're looking after themselves. It's good for the city's point of view, but it's not strictly legal. Now, you can critique it and say it's a kind of hipster urbanism. I'm talking about street food and community gardens. They're the most basic cliches in bottom-up urbanism you can imagine. And we can really critique it and say there are much bigger deals in the city. It's fine for people to be making community gardens, but in a way that then leaves the big boys, and usually our boys, to get on with making public hospitals and light rail systems, because you can't crowdfund those things. But still, a city would be good if it took care of the small things like that. If people every day took care of their city themselves. But importantly, government now has competition. What you're seeing there with Restaurant Day most clearly is an emergent behavior using new tools that the city can't deal with. They can't arrest Restaurant Day. There's nothing to arrest. It's like smoke. It's instructions. It's just lines of code, effectively. You can't arrest it. So, this is how Ravintolapaiva is organized over Facebook. They built their own mobile apps across 4 major mobile platforms. I didn't even really think there were 4 major mobile platforms, but they did. And they did that in a 2-day hackathon. And they're fantastic. All of the little black dots are pop-up restaurants that shows you what happens on Restaurant Day. The city can't do that. Or, as you know, what the city made when they tried to make something like this is this. And I can't tell you how bad this is, actually. I can't really convey the full horror. It's the worst thing I've seen on the internet in 10 years, and I've seen a lot of stuff on the internet. What's the future of motoring in the city? I mean, who talks like that? It's like from the 1950s, and you've got 60 characters to describe it. I mean, it's just, they followed it up with this, which is even worse. So, Like, the fact that's in Finnish, it doesn't make it any more intelligible if it was in English, actually. It's a spreadsheet online, and they paid consultants, probably at some expense, to do this as a public engagement thing. Their heart's in the right place, but they just don't have the weapons. Again, how can they compete with Facebook and an app that you can make in 2 days? So the issue is, we still need the city, because the day after Restaurant Day, I walk past, still can't get an espresso. The thing's closed for 4 months again. So because there's no change to the law, the legal system, there's no change to the institutional layer, pop-ups have very little effect. The city just snaps back to how it was. Pop-ups pop down, that's the problem, you know. They don't do enough. So we need something which sits between and pulls these things together. Because we still need those institutions. We still need to have an equitable, systemic response across the city. Bottom-up doesn't do it. It's not good enough. This small pieces, loosely joined rhetoric might work to some degree, but it's not going to work enough to do what institutions did. We do need to totally redesign them, though. That's the issue. We need to redesign institutions for the 21st century, because again, they're leftover from a previous time. There's more information about what we did around street food at that URL, openkitchen.fi, and lowtoknow.org has another approach. I'm just going to talk quickly about smart cities, because that's where I said I came in. The other thing you see in smart cities movement is the top-down, I'd call it the corporate IT approach. The IBM, the Ciscos, the GEs, Accentures, almost everybody is in this space now. At the Shanghai Expo in 2010, in the urban best practices area, which is like this, you see the Cisco pavilion. That's actually a Cisco employee pretending to be like a city council urban control room employee. The poor woman had to dress up like this and act like this. And they had this movie running, which I grabbed at the time, which was like City of the Future. And what you zoom into is actually this faked up urban control room where the city council are like these gods, like looking over a 3D holographic model of the city, and they're kind of shuffling things around like gods in ancient Greece almost, except not as interesting. And then General Motors had exactly the same thing, funnily enough, but it featured a lot more cars. So their vision was about that. And what struck me was that we've been here before. This is like in the 1960s. The desire to centralize and control and generate data that you can then understand the city through and make things more efficient was exactly the same rhetoric in the 50s and 60s through the urban planning movement at the time. Efficiency is not why we make cities. It's the last thing, actually, we make cities for, to be honest, but anyway. And what you saw in the 50s and 60s was companies like General Motors, sorry to pick on them again, lobbying the city of Los Angeles to remove the world's largest streetcar tramway system in the world in order to shift LA to a more highway-based future, because they controlled then actually, if you think about it from Cisco's point of view, more traffic on the network. In the 50s, that meant literally traffic on a road network. Now it's the same kind of rhetoric. So they took LA and they turned it into, this is actually Sydney. It's not what you think of when I say the word Sydney, but this is what a lot of Sydney looks like. And I worked with a guy in Australia who said that these kind of cities are the cities that cars built when we weren't looking, which is kind of a nice way of thinking about that suburban sprawl. And the problem is that we were looking. It was intentional. So we took Sydney actually from something like this, which in 1906 had, look at the way the street moves here, this beautiful ballet of the street, as Jane Jacobs would have said. People can drift on and off it at your own pace, you can cycle, there are trams, you're kind of effortlessly kind of blurred edge to the pavement. It's a lovely continuous flow. Now, I don't want to get misty-eyed because the bubonic plague was 2 blocks away to the left when this film was taken, literally in Sydney in 1905, I think. So I'm not saying we should go back. I am saying would it be interesting to recreate the conditions of the way that that street feels for a 21st century city? Might be an interesting question. So let's not make the same mistakes again. Let's not recreate the mistakes of 50s, 60s urban planning just in a different mode through smart cities rhetoric, that kind of centralized order. It's too concentrated on infrastructure, and we don't make cities to make infrastructure. It's a side effect. You know, it's not the reason they exist. We make cities to make culture, to make commerce, to make community, to make conviviality, to make this thing called the city itself, which, if you want to be poetic about it, is some other higher order of human existence that we've been on for 40,000 years, this trajectory towards cities. all of those things are quite inefficient, interestingly enough. Like culture isn't efficient. Going to watch a football match is not efficient. Having an affair, writing a book, they're not efficient things, but that's what we do in cities to some extent. I don't have an affair, by the way. That's just an example. There are other ways to work with citizens which are interesting to look at. So this idea from Holland of shared space, where you have no regulation around this traffic intersection. There are no signs, there are no traffic lights. This is one of the safest ways you can make an intersection. You add traffic lights to this and there will be accidents. So what happens is people look in each other in the eye and they negotiate the space as individuals, but as actors within a system. In Constitución in Chile, after the city was flattened by earthquakes, they remaster planned the city in 90 days, which is basically unheard of. That usually takes 10 years. And they did it in a completely new way through this idea of hybrid forums, by working with citizens very directly in collaboration with them. It was a completely different response. So this idea of active, engaged citizens is a completely necessary antidote to the top-down stuff, and we can draw it from the bottom-up stuff. Again, we need to find this middle ground, though. I do, by the way, have in the back of my mind the voice of Bruce Sterling, who's here, probably. He and I emailed a little bit about the essay that I wrote about this, and he pointed out, of course, that sometimes we should just also, this plea to be active, engaged citizens is a bit too much all the time. It's a real exhortation. Sometimes it's just nice just to be, and not be inactive, actually. So we have to kind of bear that in mind as well. I think it's very important. Equally, when we're looking at these kinds of technologies like social media or the things I've described, we have to understand the bias of that and the limits of that. So I talked about the limits of top-down. Social media itself is also pretty disastrous if we just chucked the entire city at it. If we think of Adam Curtis's movie, All That's Shoveled by Machines of Loving Grace. Can I get the volume up at this bit, maybe?
Show the limitations of the self-organizing model. It cannot deal with the central dynamic forces of human society. Politics and power.
That's really key. There's a real limit to what we can do using that approach. It's not democratic to use social media for things. Just to be clear, it's not a democratic thing. You can use it as part of a democratic system, potentially, but it's not an answer in itself. It doesn't scale as well. As we said, bizarrely, it's easier to crowdsource a revolution than a light rail system. We can do Arab Spring and Occupy and Beppe Grillo, but you try and crowdfund a public hospital or a national railway system, that doesn't work so far. So it'd be interesting to think, well, why is that? What are the limits of that, again? So let's not make the mistake of loading too much in the bottom-up emergent camp as well. We could swing either way, way too much. Somewhere in the middle is the answer. So can you adopt the dynamics of that stuff is the question. Can you say, for instance, solve this NIMBY problem, not in my backyard, turning it into a YIMBY problem, yes, in my backyard, where you make things that people can engage with to suggest ways they could get involved in the city. So again, I won't go through this in detail because I don't have time, but there's a system, Brickstarter, that we designed in Helsinki, which looks like this. I designed it very quickly, so be gentle. It took about 2 days. But it's what happens if you chuck social media and crowdfunding idioms, basically, at the idea of urban planning, and just see what happens, see what comes out of that thing. And we did this as a design research piece, working with the city, to actually get into, well, what would that kind of thing look like if I could propose a use for this building as a citizen, but then engage with the city in the process of way that happens. I can maybe crowdfund bits of it, but not the whole thing. I can work with votes, but the relationship between votes and funding is very complex. So we did this to actually ask the question, to figure out the right thing to do, not to suggest this is the answer. And crucially, with the city on board. You don't use these things to sidestep institutions or go around them like the Maginot Line continually, but actually work with them to reshape the way that cities work. So that's using a website actually to get at something much deeper in a way. I started with the Arab Spring. It seems odd to end up with a website. At the same time, in some way, we know that the Arab Spring was in part enabled by these new tools. So can you use these new tools to actually unpick those bigger questions about what the city is for, who it's for, who decides, that kind of thing. Really, this is a social contract, the relationship between citizen and government. What does that look like? So yes, we absolutely need active citizens. Using this idea of the piazza and Facebook for an example, a placeholder for that kind of stuff. But we also need active government to be a player in this in a smart way, to find a new way of working for that. So I'll just finish with 4 thoughts on that. as a designer or a producer or a policy person or something in this space, working with cities, address public good. It's absolutely key. Building a sense of purpose and creating the idea of the city as a public good will be the first thing we need to do to have a much deeper, richer conversation about that, which is beyond just infrastructure, beyond just connectivity, actually about what is the city for. It's a public thing. Design to ask questions. Use design, as I just showed with Brickstar, to suggest questions. We use those things as kind of design probes, if you like. To understand that. You know, think about the inefficient city as well. How can we capture inefficiency within a system in an interesting way? That's a really tough question, actually. It's not an easy thing to build for. Understand drivers, not just enablers. Enablers are things like infrastructure, connectivity, buildings, urban planning, all of that stuff. The drivers of cities, why we exist, that's another thing. And focusing on those might be a smart thing to do. And then design the conditions for systemic change. So enough pop-ups, please, enough of the tactical solutions. Think how they can scale equitably across the city and beyond. That would be an interesting thing. Redesigning the institution to enable. That's why we have institutions to do that kind of thing. So designing better cities includes redesigning how we make decisions itself, the decision-making process, what we call politics for shorthand. And we do that by understanding what the city can be. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have a few questions for you. I mean, first of all, some of the examples that you showed, I mean, for instance, the Open Restaurant Day, maybe you have something in Amsterdam, where I'm from, or in the whole of the Netherlands, actually, on Queen's Day. You know, everybody can sell anything on the street.
Exactly.
So basically, every Dutch household puts all its old stuff on the street, and a year later, it goes back into everybody else's house. It doesn't need technology. It doesn't need Facebook or website. I mean, it can be done without it. So it doesn't. It's not new in that respect.
No, I think, and Queen's Day is a good example, because I know it and I know what you mean. At the same time, I think there's something interesting about the effortless nature of building something like that now, because Queen's Day has a long tradition. How do you build a new tradition? And maybe Restaurant Day is an example of a new tradition. And it did just take basically 3 or 4 disgruntled people to say, let's use Facebook. You know, let's not try and do it in any other way. Let's use a new tool in a very simple way that we know can scale, that we know then is visible and transparent and open to some degree, enough that it would then work. And then it's scaled to, I think there's 12 different countries. You know, there's hundreds and hundreds of things. Again, it's gone
Restaurant Day is now
much
really
bigger. Yeah, it's gone way outside of Finland now, and this is why it's ironic, because Helsinki City Council would like to sort of claim that as an example of, look at how cool Helsinki is, but they can't because it's still illegal. You know, they haven't really updated, again, their response to it. So I think there is something about the old idea of living in cities is where Queen's Day traditions come from, the tradition of community-based actions. What I find interesting is that the tools that they have to use now are so incredibly powerful, and that's the problem for the city. They're still working in I'd say an IT framework, and we're in a post-IT world now. It's gone, it's done, that's all finished.
It's just an aside, but we have a very interesting Queen's Day this year because it's going to be King's Day next year. So this year the king is... no, honestly. So now the Dutch government is trying to have everybody download an app that will purely use for control over where everybody is in the city, because it's such a full city. Another question, you think a lot about cities. I mean, one of the most important developments perhaps for cities is that through e-commerce, a lot of the retail and shops will disappear, and in some scenarios that will happen sooner rather than later. Mm-hmm. What do you feel about it? What will that do to cities?
It could be a very good thing. As in, a lot of the shops that will disappear probably weren't very good shops. I think the shops that stay are probably the good ones. So what you're seeing is it's a classic disintermediation. It's a clear out of the middle layer, the stuff that wasn't particularly independent or interesting or curated in any way. That was just a high street, mainstream offer that was very homogenous from town to town. Of course that's going to go, because it's a lot easier to do that online. But real individual character, something genuinely characterful that understands the importance of a physical space and display and customer service and great products and all, strong retail, basically. I think
There's
there's
a lot of-
absolutely a
yeah.
future for that.
A lot of cities are basically organized around, well, the market, the place where
Completely.
goods are exchanged.
I don't see markets going anywhere, because markets are, a wonderful physical, social interaction in space. You could have a digital layer on top of that, which reinforces it. The stuff that'll get kicked out is the stuff that wasn't any good anyway.
Okay. Well, you gave examples of cities that don't get it, city governments, local authorities that don't get it, and ones that do, and citizens that get it, and audience that don't, perhaps. Can you give 2 examples? A city where the authority does really well, and a city where the inhabitants do really well.
Ooh. That's a very difficult question. Because I don't know any cities, major cities, that are doing this stuff particularly well. I think the problem is that it's a challenge to that entire way of working. So there are a few interesting examples, like the city of Boston has a new office called the Office for New Urban Mechanics, which is kind of an interesting cross-disciplinary interface on a bunch of their existing departments. That might bear fruit, I don't know. But just to be clear about Helsinki, Helsinki is one of the best run cities in Europe, in the world. It runs incredibly well. The reason why they haven't had much activism in the past is actually because big government works there incredibly well. It just delivers, actually.
And you now live in Italy, right?
I live in Italy, which is
different.
But in those kind of cities, actually, you then have a much more active, engaged citizenry, just as you do in Berlin, actually. Yeah. I think that's why I showed the Schoenberg example. Berlin has a history of activism at a citizen layer, which I find totally compelling and fascinating. In some response, it's because the city can't deliver. So that's why those planter boxes emerged, because the city wasn't doing it anyway, so the citizens took it upon themselves. So what I find interesting is, how can we reinforce that, but then also use that to learn, well, how should the institution work in a new collaborative way with citizens? And again, I don't really know of many cities that are really doing this exceptionally well at the moment.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.